We have had so far quite stimulating discussions, but you are going to realize, to your sorrow, that although Christopher Wasserman, the founder, is a man with a very good heart, unfortunately, Smadja and Smadja, we are slave drivers. And so we are continuing to drive you hard, and until you go to bed, your only reward moment will be the concert tonight. So you need to be prepared, because we have quite a number of discussions before you just crash into your bed tonight. Crash is even more brutal, you know. We have been already discussing a number of things related to the topic of our discussion now. But in a way, what we want to do with this discussion is to help crystallize a number of things that have been already said this morning, but to go beyond what has been said this morning. The business of business is more than just business. We realize today that, as Christopher mentioned in his opening welcoming remarks, that there is today a dimension in business activity, a dimension in corporate responsibility that goes way beyond just doing business. And we realize also that expectations have been growing with respect to the roles that business, the roles that corporate leaders have to play in pushing a country up the level of social cohesion, social development, inclusiveness, reducing the gap in terms of wealth distribution, and so on and so forth. Of course, these are concepts which are not yet making full unanimity. You have still this notion that there is, on some instances, a kind of conflict between shareholders and stakeholders. And there has to be, of course, a trade-off. But more and more, there is a demand for responsible leadership from the part of business leaders, from the part of corporation. There is more and more a demand for their involvement, if what you might want to call the greater good or the common good. And the question is how corporations are responding to this demand, how they are adjusting their philosophies, their mindset, their modus operandi, at least to be seen as responsive to this new need and to this new expectation. And so let me introduce the friends with whom we are going to share some idea during this discussion. If I go to my far left, Mark Drewell is the Chief Executive of Globally Responsible Leadership, and he comes from Britain. Then we have Charlotte Wolff, who is General Manager and Group Head of Corporate Responsibility at Arcelor Mittal. Antonin Pujos, who is a member of the board of the Zermatt Summit Foundation, is also former chairman and founder of the Research Club in France and the French Institute of Directors. And Mallika Sarabhai, who many of you know, who you just heard Mallika, just a few minutes ago, is, as she described herself, as a social activist. She's also an artist. She's an entrepreneur from India. So let me start the discussion with you, Mark, because, as we said, you are the Chief Executive of Globally Responsible Leadership. And let me ask you, what is a globally responsible leader, a globally responsible business leader. Because these are the kind of notion, as we said before in the previous discussion on social entrepreneurs, everybody speaks about that, but when you try to pinpoint a definition, then you realize that there might be many meanings about this notion. Everybody wants to look good, everybody wants to be seen as globally responsible, but when you go into it, what is it exactly to be a globally responsible leader? Mark.
Thank you, Claude. I mean, it's fascinating being the kickoff speaker in the session after lunch, and everybody's full of food and relaxed. And I'll try and say a few things to bring us out of that comfortable mode.
And there is a bonus for the most provocative speaker. Tomorrow night it will be given to the most provocative speaker.
Well, I will endeavour to be thought-provoking rather than provocative for the sake of it. It's interesting you say this phrase is well understood. I got a letter in 2004 from George Kell, the head of the United Nations Global Compact, and his letter said, we're getting a group of companies and business schools together to answer the question, what do we have to do to create a new generation of globally responsible business leaders? I thought that was really interesting, so I got onto the internet and I Yahooed the term globally responsible leaders and leadership. I didn't Google it because, of course, in 2004, Google didn't exist, which is a fascinating insight about how fast things change. And what I discovered was it didn't exist anywhere on the web. So here's the first insight, is that this is a phrase that has become common currency in our lexicon when it didn't exist 10 years ago. And having been sort of part of that small group that was, I guess, the trigger for it, the underlying idea was the notion that the challenge of leadership in the time in which we were living was about recognizing that we were part of an integrated, connected, joined-up global system. And therefore, the essence of responsible leadership was that you had to take cognizance of that fact. When we kicked off our work, we thought it was really simple. All you had to do was teach people something different at a few business schools, and they would come out and realize that the world was a slightly more challenging place and get on with making everything better. What we rapidly concluded was that you couldn't do that unless you looked at this dynamic at three levels. And this is where I think you start to see the definition of what it means to be a globally responsible leader. And that is that the challenges that we face involve a requirement, first of all, at the personal level of transformation. The internal dynamic of each individual, which has two aspects to it. One aspect is just finding out what's going on. And this, in our siloed world, may sound like a remarkably simple statement. But, for example, internalizing the fact that shopping doesn't actually make people happy is something that we haven't done a very good job of at the basic level of psychological knowledge. At the level of environmental knowledge, we haven't done a terribly good job of internalizing the fact that you can't have perpetual resource-led growth on a finite Earth. So there's a sort of baseline level of knowledge, but there's also this question of how you engage at the heart and soul level, because that's where you create the will to act. So it's two things. It's cognitive knowledge and it's the heart and soul connection to create the will to act. So that's the first one. The second one is about the transformation of organizations. So you've got the individual, you've got the organizations in which you operate. And there I see broadly two strands. We've heard a lot about the second strand this morning, which is about social entrepreneurship. It's about people who don't know you have to do things in the way they were always done, just creating new organizations. And personally, I think that's where the real change is emerging in the world. The other half is retrofitting existing organizations and institutions. And I'm slightly cynical about that because I think the best we can do is kind of push them slightly to one side until this emergent new ways of doing things comes to the front and gradually the old system withers on the vine. And then the third piece about being a globally responsible leader, so you've got the personal development, you've got the organizational change that you have control over. And that's about being engaged in the transformation of the system. So time and time again, you will hear business articulate that we can't do things that we would like to do as individual human beings, as individual organizations, because the system is set up in the wrong way. So globally responsible leadership is actually about saying, okay, let's do something about that. And I could talk about lots of examples of that, but maybe I'll just stop there and allow the conversation to continue, and then we can come back to some of those things.
Okay, we will get back to some of the point, Mark. But now let me turn to you, Mallika, because in a way, coming from India, and India is becoming really a big player, 1.2 billion people or 1.3 billion people, nobody knows exactly. And we have seen India emerging as a new center of economic activity in the world. But I would like to ask you, from your experience, and you were just mentioning a very specific case just a few minutes ago, how do you feel Indian leaders are emerging as globally responsible leaders? And I would like to use the example of India on a specific purpose, because, for instance, I know many business leaders in India, and I know that there is a lot of philanthropic activities from a lot of these business leaders, from a lot of corporations. But in a way, what we are talking here about globally responsible leaders go way beyond just philanthropy. So if you look at the perspective of an emerging market country like India, where it might seem that the first priority is to catch up in economic terms, what does that mean to do? What do you expect as a social activist from a globally responsible leader, especially in the context of a country like yours?
The greatest tragedy about India today is that there are politicians, there are oligarchs, there are godmen and women, and there aren't leaders. In 1.3 billion people, it's very hard to find a leader who thinks beyond the immediate, who thinks of the kind of things we discuss about here, about what a global leader is. We are still in a mindset where we are trying to see if we can race the United States in becoming the largest producer of X, Y, or Z. And I think that is the tragedy of my country. I was on the global GSC of the Wolff on the future of India a few years ago. And the 16 of us who met in Dubai for that decided that the largest and greatest problem facing India was corruption. And the Wolff already has a sort of pact on corruption that corporations sign into. And the Godrej Corporation was the only corporation from India that had signed into it. So we said that over the next 6 months, before we meet at Davos, let us go to major corporations and say, are you at least willing to say that you will try your best in being honest, in saying that transparency is something that needs to be developed? And can you as an industry get together, for instance, steel manufacturers, can all steel manufacturers get together and actually introspect and say, which are the points at which corruption is happening? And how can we, with government, get together to iron out those so that it becomes a less corrupt system? It's 3 years since then, and I don't think a single company has signed this. And that is the tragedy. There was an interesting happening 2 weeks ago in India. One of our ministers had to resign because it was found that since he became minister, his family's wealth had gone up 3,000%. And he claimed that he had nothing to do with it, knew nothing about it. Finally, he had to resign. And there was a whole debate in the newspapers about conflict of interest. And there was an interesting reading from one of our best social commentators, a man called Shiv Vishwanathan, where he said that in the Indian system, there is no conflict of interest, ever. Because if I am a minister, I remain part of my family, so the family has to gain. I remain part of my community, so the community has to gain. I remain part of my religion, so the religion has to gain. So how can there be a conflict? Everybody has to win. Everybody I'm connected to has to win. And I think that is a very crucial thing in what we are talking about. Because if I genuinely feel that the entitlement is mine and my larger families, then it can never be the world. We might in Hinduism say Vasudhaiva Kutumbikam, which means at its essence that the world is my family, but that's not how it operates. And that's how it, I think there's a big issue there.
Thank you, but at the same time, what you have described is unfortunately, I would say, the general reality of India. But at the same time, we see today, let's say, a growing demand for business to become a little bit more responsible. We see from civil society, from the new middle class, the fledgling middle class, a kind of demand, a kind of expectation. And to what extent could that be the pressure that would create some change?
Every industrialist's wife runs an NGO. Every single one, without a doubt. And the idea of corporate responsibility, and this brings me back to the Ben and Jerry context this time, does co-opting the enemy mean that you wash your own conscience clearer? Corporate social responsibility in India is because the law forces it. Very little of it is actually trying to envision what would make for a better country. Corporate social responsibility to a large extent, I'm not saying it doesn't do good, even if you educate 50 more children, it still does good. But is that what you expect of a global company with 100 billion turnover or whatever? You are still saying that if my factory is in X city, then let me feed the slums around that, or let me start small industry. But that's still about, it's still about personal PR. It's not about having a vision for what is good for India. I will just take 2 minutes and give you an example. All of you know about the horrendous rape of the Delhi student, which led to her death, and the whole of India came out in the streets to talk about violence against women. Well, a month later, there was a global phenomenon called 1 Billion Rising, where 180 countries came together, men and women, to say, stop, we will not remain silent about violence and so on. Now, violence affects 50% of the population in everywhere. We ran something called Ahmedabad Rising and got together, spoke to 40,000 young people in the 15 days running up to it, and got together 8,000 people together in one place with no political agenda, with only the agenda saying we have to become the change and stop violence. We went to about 50 corporations to say, can you partner us? Can you partner us in several ways? We don't want money. Can you partner us in looking at your own advertising? To see, you know, do you really need a nude or semi-nude woman to sell a car battery? Can you look at your own company's mechanisms to stop harassment and so on and so forth? And I have to say that whereas about 100 NGOs got together, 500 schools and colleges got together, newspapers supported us, radio stations supported us, but not a single corporation wanted to come and actually do something that was globally responsible in trying to stop violence against women, but that might have led to their having to change their advertising or branding strategy.
Thank you. We will come back to 1 or 2 points here because you are raising some very interesting questions with your analysis. Let me turn to Charlotte, Wolff, and of course you represent or you are part of a very, very big organization, Arcelor Mittal, and in a way we have seen the name of Arcelor Mittal in the news recently. Decision had to be made with respect to closure of some plants or reducing some activities. And for a company like ArcelorMittal, how do you try to manage, and I guess this is part of your responsibility, how do you try to manage this balance between shareholders' interest and pressure and stakeholders' perspective? What is the kind of very subtle delicate lane lines that you need to be working on. How can you describe that?
Well, I'll try to do my best. Thank you very much for that big question, following some very interesting observations from my fellow panelists. We also, the heading for this panel is also about moving up a country. So I want to talk about it in that context. And I kind of rewrote my little speech 5 times this morning, listening to everybody, because I think there's so many strands you can go off on. We are a listed entity. We have a fiduciary duty to pursue profits. I think this came out of a couple of the questions just in the session before. That is our self-interest, and it's enshrined in law, etc. Of course, the reality is not so simple, and you have regulation to make sure that you do it in a responsible way. You have wider constituency groups to consider nowadays, and so on. Now, we're not here to debate the morals or values of an organization, so I kind of leave it at that. But I think it's important to remember what is a for-profit business for, and what is your duty as an officer of that company. So I want to move back into self-interest, which is a little bit what you were just mentioning there in India. I want to talk about Liberia. Liberia had a terrible civil conflict that lasted for 14 years. It finished in 2004. Hundreds of thousands of people had been affected, if not murdered. I think I've seen some statistics from the UN that the rape rate was around 80%. Absolutely horrendous situation. Arcelor Mittal negotiated with the interim government following the truce. And a year later, we then negotiated a deal with the first elected democratically elected government. So we moved into Liberia. Now you have to imagine, I've heard that it's one of the few countries in the world where war has been so devastating. Somalia, apparently, I haven't been there myself, but equally so. There's no infrastructure in place. There's no electricity. The roads are atrocious. There's just very, very little to go off. So this was the scenario when we set foot in Liberia. But I have to say that it's been a very interesting journey, and I can't draw all the lessons out of it yet, but I think there's some red thread that I hope that we can document for our other operations as well. The first thing we had to do was to rehabilitate a railway from the port site to the mine. And this is very important also to bring the equipment from the port up to the mine so you can build the mine. Typically how you do it is that you have an enormous piece of machinery that probably costs many, many millions, if not hundreds of millions, that you put on the tracks, and it kind of sort of lays the concrete ties. It looks like closing a zip if you look down from the sky. That's kind of how it works. I think that's how you build a railway in Australia or the US today. Now, this wasn't possible for us in Liberia for a lot of reasons. I mean, how do you even insure this kind of a piece of equipment in a place like this? How do you even bring it ashore when the ports haven't been dredged, etc.? So with some enlightened leadership locally, some clever person, or maybe it was several, I don't know, I wasn't there at the time, realized there must be another way how we can do this. And we are under a lot of pressure. We have license obligations to be up and running very soon. So we decided to build this railway or rehabilitate the railway by manual labor. So rather than employing a very expensive piece of kit and a couple of people, at the height of the construction activity, we employed 5,000 people. So work parties, laying timber ties down and rehabilitating this railway. What's very interesting is that in a country with about 80 to 85% unemployment rate, this is a really important decision to make. It is expected that every salaried person in Liberia has more than a dozen dependents. So it's really important to take this decision. And this decision really had a big impact on society at the time. It also gave hope, I think. I mean, this is a humble statement to say, but I would have thought it really brought some hope into the country that it was back into business. We had mobile health clinics, water, food on site, and it was a really uplifting environment. And you can find on YouTube, there's some videos on this, but it's amazing to see. It's like ants on a track. It's fantastic. There hadn't been formal employment in this country for so long. very swiftly moving on. I mean, that was one way of how to do business differently because the circumstances demanded that. But I have to say that it wasn't easy to make this decision because where do you find crowbars for 5,000 people? Nobody produces them en masse anymore because you don't make railways in this way anymore. But just about partnership, I also wanted to mention about Liberia. Liberia's we sort of invested in Liberia, and thereafter others followed. The country was back in business and open for business again. But for us, it's very important that we achieve as much social cohesion and also good business environment, because that is the way we can preserve our self-interest to make sure that we have a good, profitable, and secure mining operation. So we partnered up with the GIZ, the German Agency for Technical Development, and set up something called the Corporate Responsibility Forum for Liberia. And the idea was that all the incoming multinationals and us would meet and have this forum together with local businesses that sort of start springing up here and there, and to do quick knowledge transfer on human rights, occupational health and safety, environmental management, quality systems, all kinds of different things like this, to make sure that they could quickly operate to an international standard. But this was really, really important because, again, serving our self-interest, we want to operate in a corruption-free environment. So anti-corruption was one of the first sort of big workshops that we held. So just a couple of examples what we've done, and we actually now moved on to another sort of partnership program, or I guess we can call it a program, but we kind of realized in Liberia, operating business as usual just doesn't work. So you have to think slightly differently about things, and when you operate a mine, you have to look at the environment very carefully. So we set up a multi-stakeholder platform involving the Environmental Protection Agency, local community groups, as well as international conservation groups, to look at how could we actually offset or compensate some of our environmental impact in Liberia. Rather than maybe buying some forest somewhere else in the world, we wanted to do it in Liberia. So that program is still under development, but it's a very exciting way of doing things, and we've learned so much through this partnership. Now, partnerships take time, and sort of stakeholder approaches take time, but I think we have a much stronger operation on site. But I still want to mention that this is pure self-interest, but I think, and hopefully in a few years, we can document to see where did things go right in this project, because I think we've made some right decisions at the right time, which has also attracted more inward investment. So our pledge for investment is about $1.5 billion. I think now is up to $19 billion in the country. So I think we helped the country to be back in business, and I hope eventually we can see backwards and see that this investment and our investment in the country really made a difference.
Thank you. Mallika, you heard this example of Liberia. So in your view, that would be unthinkable in an Indian context?
Nobody's done it as far as I have read or seen. I think that's great. I mean, 2 years ago, there was a gentleman here from one of the Indian companies with an impeccable record of giving back to society in every way, perhaps the greatest record of any Indian company. But they had also just partnered with a government and had 25,000 farmers thrown off their land. You know, I'm not sure where the balance is. I think everything that is good, but you have to balance it on a larger scale and say, is it good enough?
Yes, but at the same time, in a way, the issue of how, in a way, you help pushing a country up, how can business help pushing a country up?
I will just give you an example. I come from a state called Gujarat, which is touted as a miracle, an economic miracle.
The most efficient state in India.
Most efficient state. Okay. It has the highest, in the 10 years when it's being seen as this model of development, all the human indices, education, health, the number of women being born and allowed to live have all fallen according to the Human Development Index nationally. It has generated the least jobs of any comparable state in India, and it has the highest rate of people going below the poverty line. Now, according to me, this is not a miracle, it's a disaster. But the Tatas and the Essers and the Adanis have profited and pushed up the GDP. But, you know, I mean, what is it that you're looking for? Mrs. Madhya said earlier, we need to have new definitions. We definitely need to have new definitions. Because is GDP what gives us our well-being? No.
So in a way, what you are saying, and again, I think this is at the core of our discussions, that just pushing the figures up doesn't do the trick.
Because the figures only refer to the richest.
And in the case of Liberia that you mentioned, in a way, pushing the figures up was doing the trick because it was more than just
And
creating.
because they were employing 5,000 people where there was no employment.
Exactly.
No, I have to caveat that because I think figures are really dangerous, as you say. And I think if you look into Liberia and past before the war, it was, I think it's the richest country in the region.
Yes.
Because, you know, concentrated wealth and so on. But I think mining in itself today is quite an efficient operation. So you don't employ 5,000 people in a mine. This was during construction. However, and I don't know if, you know, exactly what's happening right now, but I'm hoping that all those people that worked on the railway, they learned certainly many skills because we were training them. We had daily briefings and supervision. So when there's all this other concession work going on, and as I mentioned, there's 19 billion in total now being invested into the country, I hope that these people are ready for work of these other concessions. But also I think what's very important is that when you operate in countries where there's a lot of need, business as usual is not enough. And you have to see yourself as a development partner of the country and understand the aspirations of its people. Because otherwise, and we heard these results of social media, etc., people will show they're upset very quickly. And then you're actually not operating very efficiently. So you have to have your ear to the ground. And what we've done in Liberia, and this is mandated for all of our units, you have to have an effective stakeholder engagement program in place. So in Liberia, we have 52 local consultative forums with 7 people each, half of them women, so 3 or 4. We have youth represented and elders and somebody who can read and write. We train them on conflict resolution, how to hold meetings, how to represent your constituencies and so on. We give them airtime on phone so they can be in touch with us. But this is so essential for us because we have to understand the sort of jungle drums and what's happening and people's level on how content they are. Because where there is a lot of need, you will have a lot of business disruption to your operation. So you have to be very agile and constantly understand where the tremors are. So how do you build that into a business which is an engineering business, tight deadlines, project delivery is essential and cost a lot of money every day over time, cost a lot of money. I don't know how you do that, but it seems to work in Liberia.
I'm delighted it works. I'm just picking up on one thing she said, which is that as a mining company, you need to be partnering the development of a country. But when you talk of the development of the country, are you talking of the development of the politicians? Are you talking of the development of the oligarchs? Or are you talking of the development of the people of that country?
And that's what I said.
Exactly.
I said the country and understand aspirations of the people. Because I think you have to understand all the stakeholders.
I've just picked that up to say these are questions that need to be asked.
Yeah. So, Antonin, Pujos, let me turn to you. You have heard this example of Liberia, and in a way, it can be a good way to get to a question to you. You have been in business. You are involved in activities which are beyond business. And from your perspective, in what cases does the business involvement makes most sense, and where does it bring the most added value when you look at the role of business beyond just pushing the figures up, if you want?
I just wanted to start by saying that I know Liberia. And one morning I had to shave myself in the swimming pool of the hotel, just to tell you how it works, you know. Now, I'm slightly stressed because I'm not so much used to speak in public, and I will have to refer to my piece of paper. And the reason why I'm stressed is because I made so many changes I cannot even read it anymore. So
leave aside the paper
no,
and tell us what you have on your mind.
I will say. Now, the question is how business leaders can contribute to moving a country up. I'm reading the title. And the way I see it is that it is a way to asking us to discuss the possible political role of business, basically, the political responsibility of business. Now, we have, at Zermatt, we have been lucky enough to have two very good friends, which are basically founding fathers of the corporate social responsibility in terms of academic concepts. One is Philippe de Wood, is professor at Leuven University in Belgium, and the other one is Henri-Claude de Bettini, who is here today, and he's a professor at INSEAD, Stanford, the IBS, I don't know, you name them. And they have been kind enough to write a paper last year, which is called the Zermatt Summit Manifesto, which describes the responsibility of what you call the global leaders. And what they say is that beyond being innovative entrepreneur and creative servant leaders, the global leaders have to develop, to assume a posture of statesman. Okay? Statesmanship, as Philippe de Wood and Henri-Claude call it, implies a strong willingness to give back to the business activity its political dimension. Such dimension being imposed upon business by the obvious responsibility it carries for the world in which it operates, very simply. But how could the business leaders appear as statesmen? Certainly. But very simply, by contributing to the debate on the global common good. That's very, it's very straightforward, basically. But the common good should not be confused with notions frequently referred to, such as the general interest, which everybody knows, nor the addition of individual interest. The common good refers to what belongs to everyone by virtue of their common humanity. A frequent definition of the common good is it is the sum total of social conditions which allow people, either as groups or as individuals, to reach their fulfillment more fully and more easily. So it's a bit complicated. But basically, in an effort to enhance their political presence, serving the common good involves, on the part of the business leaders, a combination of courage, common sense, and strategic thinking, basically. They have to try to develop a shared vision of the kind of community or the kind of country and ultimately the kind of world in which we should be willing to live in. Once this vision starts taking form, it should necessarily retroact on the kind of companies which would best contribute to the common good. Okay. Now, this being said, the pursuit of the common good only is not sufficient. It should go together with another prerequisite imposed upon the business to restore its political dimension, namely to exemplify very concretely in the way business are operated, in the content of the decision made, what the common good is all about. This could only be achieved by doing one thing, is by placing the human person back at the heart of their activity, at the heart of the corporate enterprise. Why? Very simply, because there is nothing more concrete than a human person, with body and flesh. Okay? But what does that mean? What does this imply? It first means that the economy is to be placed at the service of the common good, for the very purpose of serving the human person. Thus, the economy has to be submitted to the needs of the human person and not the other way around, when too often the human person is entirely submitted to the technical constraints purportedly imposed on the corporation by the economy. If the economy is placed above the human person, we are making ourselves dependent on something which we should normally control. The second implication is that placing the human person back at the heart of the economy is to recognize the economy does not act on its own and that it is heavily dependent on human actions. There are human persons which are making decisions and are acting in the economy. As such, they retain full responsibility for the impact of the economy on their human fellows, whether positive or negative. There is nothing like economic fatality. The only thing which seems to be fatal is the ability of humans to make mistakes and errors. That's for sure. In other words, placing the human person back at the heart of business is to recognize that the purpose and the measure of all decisions and actions in the corporate enterprise and in the economy should always be the good of the individual human person. What I'm trying to say here is that in the economy and in the corporate enterprise, we should never leave the decision power entirely in the hands of the experts and of the technocrats, which, for the sake of uncertain and ill-defined sustainability objectives, are ready to create a totalitarian world in which the human person would be sacrificed either to nature, which, by the way, often excludes the human person when it is defined, or to the so-called general interest of the community as defined by some individuals. If the human person is placed back at the head of the corporation, business will recover its political dimension, provided, however, that it remains centered around a strong sense of responsibility and solidarity, very much beyond the mere necessity imposed on the business enterprise by entities which, with unclear legitimacy and with extremely smoky responsibility, such as the markets, the experts, or even the shareholders, in a fully liberalized and fully globalized world economy. I'm finishing very quickly. In Zermatt, we like to talk about humanizing globalization. Humanizing in this context means giving, in all circumstances, the top priority to the attention given to the human person. And to make and in order to make absolutely sure that the human person is taken care of, it is necessary to pay attention to the weakest ones, weakest in the world, weakest in the country, and weakest in the company. This is what I believe we would refer to when discussing how to contribute to moving a country up, Claude, because the more a society is capable of taking care of the weakest, the more advanced it is on the path towards humanization. Now, this being said, I think I would have fulfilled my objective today if I leave with you one single idea, one buzzword, which you could remember. This word is very simple. Are two words. It's human ecology. Let's take the example of environmental and social ecology. They have been very successful in acquiring momentum and influence in a very substantial way, and over a relatively short period of time, they have been adopted and legitimized, at least verbally, by most decision makers in the world, in the political world as in the business arena. They have even changed themselves into a world political movement called altermondialism. As a reaction to the dictatorship of the economy without a face, as Pope François calls it, as a reaction to the dictatorship of the experts, of the technocrats, of the markets, the concern for the common good, and through the common good, the concern for the human person, for his or her dignity, for his or her freedom, should quite normally emerge as a major political issue to be taken over in the political agenda of most political parties and could develop as some sort of alter humanism, which could be promoted by the business leaders themselves, provided, however, that they can be convinced that human ecology is a terrain where they could contribute again to the political debate and on which they could even take the initiative. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonin. let me turn to you, Mark. What you have heard from Antonin, this kind of description of the globally responsible business leader or corporation, would that fit your ideal profile of a globally responsible leader? What would you add to that? What would you change to that if you look at your own experience?
So I think it represents the underlying ethos of what to my mind will be the inevitable basis of being a globally responsible leader, because that's about connecting back to your deep personal humanity. I think there's quite an interesting and simple test that's emerging around the world as to the gap between that principle and action. And that test is the following. It is, as an organization, do I articulate a picture of the world that I would like to see unfolding in the future? That's the first thing. The second thing is then, as an organization, how honest am I about my contribution and negative contribution to that? And then the third one is, what am I doing about it? So the classic example is I would talk about is the notion of, it's the gorilla in the room for any organization. It's not the good things that you're doing, the lovely case studies, and you know, the mining industry is full of fantastic examples of put $1 billion into an area and you do amazing things, and you can do it cleverer or less cleverly. The interesting question is, you know, what's your core business, and how does that help or hinder the creation of a human scale, thriving future for all of humanity? And what are the bits that it stops? So, great conversation I just had recently, it's starting to emerge in the financial services sector, is the real conversation is, who do I lend money to build what? And the second conversation is, what do I invest in? And the third conversation is, how on earth can I actually make sense of this business in an environment where I am paying multiple thousands of a factor between the leaders of my organization and the people who are at the end of the supply chain in this system? So it's not about the good things you do, it's about looking for those real gaps and having a tough conversation. If I'm in the energy business, it's about how do we actually, what is my role in us getting to a clean energy future quickly, not a conversation about, well, it's too difficult and we can't do it. So I think that's the essence of what globally responsible is.
Before we get into the discussion, let me turn to the four of you and raise one point. Of course, we all know that theoretically, and in fact, most of us would like that, as we said, we need to mitigate this push for profitability with other, let's say, more human, more elevated concerns. At the same time, we know what is the pressure. I mean, I know you hate the word, Antonin, but there is the pressure of the market. A company doesn't deliver enough profits, investors turn to another slot for investment. We know the volatility of financial flows today. We know also that over the last, say, 20 years, the shelf life of an average CEO has been cut by half. Today, the shelf life of an average CEO is about 6 to 7 years, because after that, in almost all the cases, people consider that he's not performing enough, that he's not bringing enough, and he's just pushed aside, and somebody else steps in, promising to do even better, even faster. So in a way, the question is, if we have this kind of vision of the corporation helping to push the country up, how do you resist this pressure? Because after all, what the companies, the investors which are investing in companies, are the pension funds that will finance the retirement of many of us. And so, in a way, if the returns are not good enough, our retirement fund will dwindle, and we will have a very poor life after active life. So, in a way, I want to expose the kind of dilemma that are the real life dilemma, that this kind of will to push companies toward the greater good, toward abiding more to a more diversified set of priorities, at the same time, the pressures are compelling. So how do you confront these pressures? Antonin, you want to start?
I think when people think that a corporation is only made to pay dividends to shareholders, I think this vision of the corporation is absolutely obsolete today. And I would say something also is that someone mentioned the name of Mr. Polman this morning, I think. And Mr. Polman, I heard him in a conference in London back in September, and I was absolutely flabbergasted because what he started to say, you know, if you think that you are going to, to get an answer, if you ask me what is the price of your shares this morning, I'm unable to tell you because I don't care. I don't care. He said this way, and he said, I don't care because this is not my role. Okay, I am a leader here, a business leader, and I have obtained from my shareholders a change in priority. They have authorized me not to maximize the return, but to optimize it, okay, and to include other features than simply finance. And you know that Unilever has made the strategic decision to minimize its footprint, right? Which is not human. It could be the human footprint, but it's an environmental footprint. And Paul Mann was living very well with this. And what he said, when an investor comes to me, you know, these young investors, which are usually 25, 26 years old, and they come to him and say, hey, Mr. Paul Mann, you know, you could improve your return on equity, you know, your shares would perform better, and so on. He said, young man, you are talking to the wrong person, and probably also to the wrong company. Because if you are looking for maximum return, go somewhere else. Don't come to Unilever. I leave this with you.
Mark?
Just a thought. I mean, one of the things, and I saw it happening this morning, is that when we talk about business, we very quickly morph into a conversation about public listed joint stock companies, as if that is the world of business. And actually we morph further into a conversation about the process of buying and selling those organizations, which is another very small part of the total picture. And I listen to those things and imagine the millions of people who run family-owned businesses, small businesses, medium-sized enterprises, cooperatives, a whole raft of forms of business for whom this idea that the game is about maximizing profit and then trading the entity and selling it on, let alone the millions of people who work for these large organizations for whom that idea is equally absurd. And yet somehow we always end up in that sort of discussion about that's really what business is. And my challenge would be that that's not even remotely what business is. And as a retiring chairman of a Fortune 500 company said to me 2 years ago, he said, when we write the history of the 20th century, we will probably conclude that the public joint stock company with the separation of rights and responsibilities of ownership was the stupidest thing that human beings did in that century. Now, I say that to try and stir the debate up a bit, because that's really so far away from where we are in business.
Anything that Charlotte or Mallika you want to add before we get to...
I agree exactly with what you're saying, but I just wanted to bring to the attention of people who weren't here 2 years ago that there was a man called Mark Hennigan who was here 2 years ago who has a company called Give Something Back. And Mark is a child of the flower power generation who found in the 70s that most of the flower children had become bankers. And he said that, how does one completely separate one's idealism from where one is going to spend the next 30 years? So he said, why can't we invent a company that keeps the spirit of the flower power? So they started this, it's a business supplies company. And he said that we started a company where nobody would make a profit. So nobody had a share option. Everybody was on salary. Everybody was on good salaries. And the aim of the company is, A, to try and influence the people to whom we are supplying office supplies to reduce their carbon footprints, to set up systems for doing this, and to involve them and involve all our suppliers into deciding who it was amongst our society that we would like to help, and to give all the profits back to those people and to those community groups, church groups, children's organizations, orphanages, and what. And over the years, they have given back $5 million. They have now 13,000 suppliers who together sit and decide who the profits have to be churned back to, what are the community groups that they really care about in their community that they can actively involve themselves into saying, I will go and teach at this slum school. I also give money to them, but I will go and teach so that I can have a direct influence and a direct feedback. Now why are we not promoting companies like this? Why does everything always have to be bigger and bigger and bigger and more global and more global?
You know why? I'll tell you why. I met Mike Hannigan last year, in fact, in Chile. And he had a big problem because the time of his retirement had arrived and he had no money. He had no money, no shares, no money. And he was very embarrassed because he had to go back to his fellow workers to ask them for money for his retirement age.
Well, that's, then obviously the model needs to be slightly changed so that he does have money.
Yeah,
but the fact remains that for 25 years...
This is the dilemma. This is the Charlotte?
There was somebody earlier this morning was talking about the purpose of a business and what is it there for. And if I may just briefly take sort of personal journey and reflecting what you were saying about personal transformation. When I was young, and much younger, I'm obviously still very young, I worked in music marketing, and we produced sort of, I would call it Barbie doll pop. And I had quite, I think, strong values. I ran the Green Club in school and stuff like this. So I asked my boss, I said, why are we only producing this pretty rubbish music? We have so many good artists. Why don't we promote these amazing Kazakhstani singers and whatever? And then the response was, but actually, and this was during the time of CDs, not downloads. And he was saying, well, the majority of the CDs, and I can't remember the percentage, but it's ridiculously high, is bought between 11 and 14-year-olds. And this is the music they listen to. And I thought, I can't be in the business of producing bad music. This is not why I think I was born on this planet. And I have to say, moving into, I worked in telecoms for 10 years, and then in steel and mining now for almost 6 years. I love both industries because I worked for something that was spun off British Telecom, and what was most amazing, if you meet the people, the telecommunications engineers, anybody in a white van, and you ask them, what are you doing? Oh, I'm connecting the grandmother with their grandchild. They thoroughly believe it. And in steel, what I found so fantastic, and why I'm in love with this business, I'm an economist, I'm not a metallurgist, but I was taken around one of our plants the first week I worked for the company. The metallurgists are so passionate about steel, and they know that it's the fabric of life. You have no development, no modern infrastructure without steel, no hospitals, no roads, no sanitation. You need steel to improve your quality of life today. And that's so well understood. And what we're trying to do in the business now is to also make the miners understand that this is what they're contributing to give that purpose back into a miner's life and other people's lives. And I have to say, it's really important, I think, where you work and what you work for. So that was my journey, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Let's now open the discussion more broadly. First question here, and then I will turn to you, sir.
Hi. It's not specifically a question, but I think I was very intrigued by the title of the session, which was helping business, moving a country up, and I think that I think it's a great expectation that businesses do the right thing, but I think it's a little bit too much maybe at this point to expect that businesses on their own will. I mean, this is, I think, a little bit beyond, what the expectation should be at this point. First of all, I think if businesses do the basics well, they'll stop. Some businesses actually help push some countries down. Okay, so if they stop doing that, would be great. But I think it's, and it goes back to the point that was discussed of governments, going out of what they were supposed to do, and then businesses coming in with this expectation. And my question would be, maybe how, instead of saying how can business do this, how can business partner with civil society and government, then to all help, bring up, because it also, it also forces maybe some, let's say, speech and dialogue from businesses that don't actually, reflect what's going on the ground because of this pressure. I think it would be better to say, how can you partner to all, help bring society up.
Mark?
Thank you for that. My formative time in business was in working in South Africa, and I arrived there in 1989, just at the height of apartheid, and Mandela was supposed to be released and he wasn't. And over the first 3 years I was in the country, I watched, and it's a long story, so I won't tell the whole story. I'll just a tiny flavor of it. I watched thousands of business people get involved in the process of the political transformation, not around, around their businesses, but also around the company I worked for seconded 3,000 managers into the first independent electoral commission. And behind the scenes, there's an enormous story of business actually faced with the prospect of something that had never happened before, which was a peaceful transformation from a minority to a majority. This is something never been done in human history. And business people responded incredibly to that challenge, partly because they had a shared vision, and partly because they were absolutely clear that there was really no alternative. And they loved their country enough not to get on a plane and emigrate to London or Moscow or wherever it was that they felt that they would go, which is one of the problems we have today, is we all go mobile instead of fixing the problems in the places we come from. So the thing, equally there were thousands of people who did nothing. So the question for me is, what is it that enables that will to actually act beyond the day-to-day routine of your business? And my experience is that it's two things. One, it is somehow that internal compass that translates beyond the cognitive recognition that there's a problem to the heart and soul. And the second is that you actually do have a shared vision of the future. And your shared vision of the future, in that case, was about a post-apartheid South Africa. And I think one of the big things we don't have today is an articulated and shared vision of the future. We just know that what we're in and heading out, coming from, is pretty unacceptable for the future, but we're not articulating a shared vision around which we can then mobilize.
Thank you. Antonin.
You said that you were expecting companies just to do well what they are supposed to be doing, correct? I'm not sure they can do so if they don't have a wider picture of where they stand, where they want to go, in which society they are operating, what kind of a world they are supposed to create together with the rest of the people around them. That's it.
Just to second what you said, and also to show, as you very rightly pointed out, I think both of you, in fact, there are two sides to the business world. You have the publicly listed companies. They are operating under a very strict, let's say, constraints, and you have a non-listed company, family-owned, etc., which have a much wider margin of maneuver and a wider ability to adjust different priorities. But just when you were saying maybe we are expecting too much from business, just a small example. Last year, Intel made a decision to invest $7 billion in a new semiconductor factory in China. Now, this factory could have been built in the United States because the cost of labor was even, surprisingly enough, a little bit cheaper in the United States than in China. Nevertheless, Intel decided to do the factory and, of course, the jobs linked to the factory in China. They got the ground for free in the provinces, in the province where they settled. And when Intel was asked publicly, I think it was in Congress, why would they go to China instead of, in a way, going to the United States and creating the jobs in the United States? The answer of Intel was incredibly brutal. Intel, the senior executive from Intel said, look, sir, we are not in existence to provide jobs in America. This is not the purpose of our company. And so I think it illustrates very well at the same time what we are talking about here at this kind of, I was about to say, fight between two visions of what the role of a corporation is. So it is just an anecdote, but I think it illustrates your point that it is not a kind of easy road toward what we are describing here as our common objective. Next question here.
So this morning and now, we have been hearing very inspiring testimonies, basically about the what and the hows. I would like to take advantage of this wonderful panel to ask about the whys. Why do you do what you do?
Who starts? Mallika, you start.
I do what I do because I don't think I could face myself if I didn't do what I did. I think in my personal case, I was born in a family of great privilege, and I don't mean financial privilege, privilege of commitment to humanity, privilege of commitment to the betterment of larger society, an amazing education, and a language in the arts which can break down walls of prejudice more than any other language that I know. And it feels great to be able to fight for the voiceless.
Very good. Antonin.
I've been a banker for 30 years, and what I know is that there is no reason whatsoever for the corporations to lack respect for human dignity and lack respect for the human person. So, I'm trying to sell this. Yes, I had a plan. So I had a rest for a while and I start thinking instead of running. I mean, that's it. That's great.
Okay, Charlotte. Because you said you thought that you were not born to try to help sell bad music. So what were you born for?
I'm from Scandinavia, and 6 months of the year, we have endless holidays, and in the 70s when I was born, so most of my time I spent on an island in the Baltic Sea. My father used to come every weekend, and he would fish and hunt and things like that. If there's any Scandinavians here, they know exactly what I'm talking about. This is a very normal thing to do. But may I just note that we had no electricity by choice, because you don't have it out there in the archipelago, no running water, nothing like that. So you live with nature, not off nature. But I have to say that in sort of my mid-teens, my dad would fish, and the fish would have two heads or something like this. And people feel very passionate about the environment in the north, because it's so vulnerable. It's so vulnerable because like the growth period is quite short. And so I think that's where it comes from. But I don't know. But if I could just a little bit segue into what you were saying, Antonin, about humanizing globalization, and Claude, what you were saying about globalization. And in one of my previous jobs, my chairman used to be the CEO of Shell when they had the issue of the Brent Spa. I don't know if you heard of that. It was a oil rig that they wanted to sink into the ocean, and there was a public outcry. And so my former chairman used to be the CEO of the company then, and he kind of was completely taken by surprise. So when he became the chairman of the company I worked for, he said, "Charlotte, I only ask you to do one thing, only one thing." And I'm like, "Great, this is a great job, great start." And he said, "Please, I want an ethical debate in the boardroom at each of our meetings." Whoa. And he said, because if he would have had that, Brent Spa wouldn't have happened. So, and I thought that was really inspirational. I don't know if I ever managed to get the right level of ethical debate, but it's about humanizing globalization, as you were saying, and how do you do that within the constraints of the setup of capital markets, etc., as well as the personal transformation and drive that you have for whatever reason. So,
Mark?
Two very short stories to explain this. 3 years ago, I was sitting on the beach, having promised myself at 40 I would leave corporate life when I turned 45, told all my friends, so I had to, left Johannesburg, went down to Cape Town, built a distillery, and an asset management company, was sitting on the beach, and I found myself having conversations in my mind with my children 20 years' time. My oldest daughter is 12, and my youngest son is 7. And they were saying to me, "Dad, did you know what was going on in the world?" And in my future self, I was saying, "Well, of course I did. I've been looking at this system stuff for years." And they said, "Well, what did you do?" And I actually, at that moment, concluded I couldn't, how could you not do it? And the last quick one was that a friend of mine who's also a great activist around the world said it's really interesting that the happiest people he knows are the people who are absolutely certain that the future is going to be really, really difficult and that we have no hope of really creating dramatic change, but they're still trying to do something about it. So that's the world we're in.
Very good, thank you. Frederick, next question.
I don't have a microphone, but I can speak up.
Okay, why don't you speak loud?
Yeah. So
You can, I know you can.
I have a question to challenge you, perhaps, Charlotte. You described lovely things that you're doing in Liberia, a country that I also know a little bit. I'm sure you're familiar with the concept of the resource curse, and that Liberia is one of those countries that now is blessed actually with natural resources, but countries that are highly dependent on natural resources, the average looks actually very bad. They do far worse. All the indicators that Mallika were talking about, countries highly dependent on natural resources, my own country of birth, Norway, has done all right, but most countries don't, actually. And if other countries coming out of conflict, so many people don't know it, Afghanistan, it's said that below its soil are between $1 to $3 trillion worth of minerals. South Sudan, the newest country, has of course a lot of oil. The second newest country, Timor-Leste, is not aid dependent anymore. 97% of its revenues come from oil. So Liberia is now less and less aid dependent. It's not aid dependent anymore. Most of its revenues come from big investors and mid-sized investors like yours. The resource curse poses an enormous risk to Liberia, to the country, and I would suggest eventually to your investment. The fact that you don't employ too many people, yes or no, is secondary actually, because you're providing license revenues to the government of Liberia. What are you doing about that enormous risk that Liberia faces?
Well, I just came from a conference earlier this week. I can also tell you there's enormous billions worth of wealth beneath Italy and Germany and a few other countries in Europe. It's amazing where the world's going. I think, especially African countries, and I can say this because this was the topic of where I was earlier this week, the countries are very aware of the Dutch disease, or whatever you call it, and not to repeat that again. I think from our business perspective, what's very important is that we support the efforts that are in country now. And if you would see our operations, they are very much, what we're trying to do is to make operations as Liberian as possible. This is not like the old mine that we are rehabilitating from the 50s, where they certainly it looked very different. This is an African mine. And also, I think what we're trying to do is to improve the business climate as much as we can. And I think it's important for these countries, like Iberia and other ones, is to choose their partners carefully. If they don't uphold the highest level of integrity, then you do not want to partner with them. Just hold off. But there's so much public pressure on getting those investments in, especially when your tenure in government is 4 years or whatever. But they have to do that, because otherwise you lose out. And it worries me a little bit now when the industry is in a bit of a slump, because who's going to fill the vacuum when the sort of reputable businesses are maybe, not so proactive in their greenfield investments. But I think what's been really important for us is to uphold highest international standards, promote them, make sure people understand what they are. And for one example, what we've done in Liberia, last year we already published our first corporate responsibility report in Liberia. And the next one's coming out very soon. This is just, the war was over not many years ago, but we want to set the standards for the other businesses. This is the level we operate now in Liberia. And I hope that will encourage a good entrepreneurial spirit and business environment where they can really build and flourish other sets of economies as well. Also, I would like to say that I do engage with our strategic suppliers as well, to say, well, your suppliers in country, is there anything else you can do in country? So we nurture a lot of relationships like that and connect people internationally. And that's also a commitment we made to the government. We're going to help the country to come back into business.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to take 2 more questions before we close. Sushant first, and then Marlene, who wanted also to raise some point.
Thank you.
Sushant.
Thank you very much, Claude. I wanted to definitely applaud the panel, but in particular Mark for his last insight about the failure of a collective vision. One, I think, of the 100 top economies in the world, 51 of which are multinational corporations, and this is a UN Compact stat. This is a stat that's well versed in these types of circles. So we don't have we're not asking too much of these organizations. The legal systems in which we have employed have not caught up to account for their responsibility in the world. But this issue of global responsible leadership, I come from a scholarship scheme myself before I came to the UK, from the Marshall Scholarship Scheme, Marshall Schevening. And like the Rhodes and others, they're all investing in future talent. Somehow, miraculously, this talent is going to go to a good school and get access to a network and therefore change the world. And this is like schizophrenic, I think, when the real issue in a lot of these circles is that we don't have the business leaders that have the clout today standing up and saying enough is enough. We are going to take a stand aside and form this sort of collective future, or provide an alternative framework for how this future can devolve. I think that's a hugely missing piece of the pie. And take John F. Kennedy. He wrote a book called Profiles in Courage right before he was assassinated, where he profiled senators that took very strong, costs on their personal selves in order to champion issues for the public good. Right now, we don't have public stewards for good in business or in in government. And that there is a huge vacuum that enlightened business leaders can fill for the likes of other people coming out of MBA programs, scholarship programs, and whatnot, to follow, to emulate, to support, to give traction to. But unless that happens, we won't have this world that we're looking for.
Comment? Agreement on that. Marlene, you have the last question.
Tough.
Sure.
Thank you. Sorry, there is a vacuum. Sorry, and of course there's a vacuum. There should be many, many more. But with the G8 and all these things, I mean, there are people like Bill Gates and others. They do stand up, and you know, they get a lot of flack for that. So I think, but it's obviously not enough. But I think there's a few, and we heard Paul Polman. So there's maybe more to come.
Antonin?
Yes, you should talk to these leaders about human ecology.
Marlene.
Okay, thank you very much for the panel. I have two very quick points. Since the question is, okay, how do we push the country up? I think NGOs, I think businesses can learn quite a bit from previous donors and big organizations that have been funding NGOs in different countries. One of the important things is what Charlotte mentioned, looking at people's aspirations and their priorities. If you really are serious about getting the country up, not just your image. And at the same time, this is going to help the image of the business as well. Like Mallika's example, which was an amazing example, that yes, they were willing to do so much, but not willing to go to that extra step to change their brand, which would have benefited them actually greatly. I have many examples of that, but just for brevity, I will talk about my second point. Even public holding companies can have that model. And I say that it's not just about private businesses. Public holding companies, I didn't want to bring this up, but there's this one for-profit education, huge company in the US, you know, that has these number of schools all around the country, and they are held accountable. Of course, they're for-profit, and they are held accountable to their stakeholders. However, when the economy began to turn down, their solution to that was to lay off a lot of people from that company, and which really lowered the level of the services given to their customers, who are the students, and therefore it brought it even further down, because then it started having a bad reputation. Of course, social media took that over as well, and it's like, okay, so now we go to this school, what are we learning? Because the people are not there anymore. So I think it would have benefited them that in some way to I don't know much about business, but I think that for the long term, had they stood with the quality of the school and put the humans first instead of the stakeholders' sole interest. I'm not saying don't look at at their interest, but at least don't make that the only priority. I think in the long term they would have benefited. They're losing short term, and I think they will lose long term as well.
Thank you. I think we are going to close on that note because I think there is really also a business rationale in proving to be a globally responsible leader. Let me just take a few points that I would like to highlight from this discussion. I would like, first of all, to mention what has come out in many instances, which is, in a way, business as usual is not anymore enough. And what we have seen from elements of the discussion is that if you look only at the figures, and if you consider that it is just sufficient that the figures, GDP growth, productivity, that it is just sufficient that these figures, these indicators go up, you are wrong, because you need to look at other indicators. And in some ways, what we have seen happening, for instance, in the Arab world is an illustration of that, because strikingly enough, the two countries where the uprising erupted first, Tunisia and Egypt, were the countries in the Arab world where the GDP growth was the highest in the Arab world, not including the oil-producing companies. So this important element, I think we need really to take with us. The second point, and it is linked to the first one, is this notion that a globally responsible leader is here not to maximize the return, but to optimize it. And I think this is really a very important distinction between maximizing and optimizing it. Third point that I would like to take is that, in a way, and Mark, it was an interesting note from you, that this notion of globally responsible leader didn't exist 10 years ago. And it shows how things are evolving fast and how the demand and expectation for a different kind of mindset is really growing at a spectacular pace. And I think it is, in a way, important because it shows why the kind of thinking discussions that we are having here are so relevant, because they are really in the trends of things to come more and more. And then, if I want to look at what we are thinking of in terms of globally responsible leader, I think, Antonin, you gave quite a good profile, if you want, of a globally responsible leader. And I will take also the requirements that Mark said, which is personal level transformation, organization level transformation, and being engaged in the transformation of a system. Meaning by that, you cannot operate in just a kind of vacuum of wishful thinking. Another point, again, that we need also to take from this discussion is that when we look at the business world and the behavior and philosophy of the business world, we need to be careful because, as you said, there is the world of publicly listed companies and there is the world of private companies. And in a way, we see that there are significant differences in many cases in the way they operate. And of course, you can have the example of a Unilever, but let's say that the example of a Unilever is not at this stage widespread enough to really make a distinction. Whereas in the world of privately held companies, you see that kind of new spirit emerging more and more. And by the way, we saw many German companies at the time of the downturn behaving in a way that allowed them to keep all their employees because they knew that this was the right thing to do. And then the last point that I would like to take from the discussion is something which I believe has come already this morning, but is very important. It is this need that we have for an articulated, shared vision of the future, because it is only when we have that and we have some kind, let's say, of rallying around this shared articulated vision, that then the pressure on the publicly listed companies to look beyond maximizing profit will become almost unbearable for them. So at this stage, I would like to conclude this session. And before we thank our speakers, let me tell you that thankfully you have about 25 minutes of break now, and then we are resuming on two important discussions, because we have been talking about the broad picture until now. The next two sessions, we are putting our feet on the ground. We are taking two very concrete illustrations. One is the session on how business and NGOs can collaborate to create employability. So this is a very concrete example, not only for developing countries, but when we learned this morning that unemployment in Europe next year, at the beginning of next year, will be 12.7%. And so this session on employability will be in the next door. And then we are going to talk about how business and NGOs can collaborate better on the environment, which is a concern for all of us. And this discussion will take place here. So we have a short break of 25 minutes, and then we resume in the two rooms. And before we leave, a big thank to our speakers.